Hi folks, in this podcast extra, Lesley speaks to Craig Murray and to Sarah Salyers from Salvo about their moves at both Geneva and in New York at the UN, taking forward the case for Liberation Scotland.
Across New York, Craig Murray has been lobbying pretty vigorously on Scotland's behalf. Craig is a Scottish author, human rights campaigner, journalist and foreign diplomat. Craig, what have you been doing in New York?
What we've been doing essentially is lobbying diplomatic missions, lobbying ambassadors and senior diplomats from United Nations member states with a view to getting Scotland recognised by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory. And also, this, for most of them, is the first time they've really heard that there's a serious campaign for Scottish independence or a serious prospect of it happening. It's just not particularly on your horizon if you're a representative of a South American or an African country to the United Nations, for example. So we're at the, if you like, the first stages of getting the argument and the explanations over to people and of making friends.
Now Sarah has been talking about Geneva. You've been in New York. Are you just going everywhere the UN meets to try and bang the drum?
Yes, essentially, I was also in Geneva with Sarah, and the Geneva side is concerned with human rights, and obviously the human rights as of the Scots as a people with a right to self-determination come in there, and that's where we emphasise that aspect. The decolonisation process is run out of New York. And that's where the responsibility for non-self-governing territories is held. So we really need to be covering both bases.
We've heard Sarah's ideas about the decolonisation argument. It's still one that for a lot of Scots who feel a bit guilty actually about our role in the empire will sort of think, we just haven't suffered the way that most people you would normally call a colony have suffered. How do you make that argument?
I think we have. I think it's just rather distant from us. But, to tell all the people in the Highlands who were killed in the second half of the 18th century and all the people who were cleared off their land and all the people who were forced by deliberate government policy to emigrate out of Scotland, I think they will feel they suffered. And it always surprises me that people don't have any difficulty in accepting that Ireland was a colony. And yet Ireland had a Treaty of Union. Ireland had members of the British Parliament. Ireland had a great many people in the British Army involved in colonial conquest. Ireland had slave owners and links to the slave trade. All of those things are as true of Ireland as they were of Scotland. Because it is no longer a colony, people don't have this blurred vision in seeing that Ireland was a colony. And Scotland was just a colony in precisely the same way that Ireland. Scotland is a colony in precisely the same way that Ireland was a colony.
And so does the argument rest very much? And, somebody with a family that was cleared, don't get me wrong, it rankles deeply. And all our land ownership patterns that flow from that feudal times are still gripping Scotland and making it almost impossible for people to get affordable land across a whole country, an empty country. So, yeah. But is the argument hinged upon those hurts then? Is that where it centres?
Not once we get to New York. You need to have you need to have an origin story argument for your colonisation. And that's what the work which Sarah has done provides, and it's reinforced by our lawyers in Geneva, JPTI, who put that forward. But it's not really what's of interest to diplomats in New York today. They want to know, okay, this is happening. Scotland may become independent. What would the consequences be for us of Scottish independence? And that's where we talk about things like reform of the United Nations. The large majority of countries in this world are desperate to reform the United Nations. The outdated system with the permanent five who were the victors of the Second World War having unshiftable places on the Security Council and a veto over everything, that's something which is a huge affront to the global South, and which people are desperate to change. And you talk to them, but if we split up the United Kingdom, it's by no means automatic that England would be recognised as the successor state and would maintain its permanent 5 status. And if England doesn't, then that opens up the whole question of United Nations reform and the permanent 5. You talk to them about that, and they're really interested. If you talk to them about the Scottish people's culture, our political culture, the fact we are much more inclusive and socially aware in many ways, and that, for example, the Scottish government has blocked all activities under its control involving Israel, and that we're not going to be a part of the neo-imperialist setup run by the United States. And this is going to weaken the power of the US-UK continuum in terms of projecting force upon the rest of the world. You talk to them about those consequences and they get very excited indeed. So you need them both. You need the story of colonial exploitation to explain how we are a colony, how our resources are taken from us, our people are deprived, how we don't have autonomy. And then you need to explain how writing that is going to benefit the rest of the world and benefit the things which their nations stand for.
Right. So then, I mean, that latter set of arguments are largely canny, political, pragmatic arguments, actually.
Exactly. And that's how diplomacy works. If you like, you have to take into account the self-interest of the states who you are trying to convince. Unfortunately, it'd be lovely to say that states vote for things at the United Nations on the basis of idealism, but that's only a very limited part of the truth.
But then we know it works the other way, because obviously there was the big problem of the Spanish veto at the time of the last referendum, or the threat of it. There will be as many states who have a Catalonia in their midst that they don't want to wake up on colonial arguments. So I guess, in the end, you might get quite a lot of the global South interested. But will that be enough to really get this over the line?
Effectively, I mean, we always have to be very careful to distinguish ourselves from other states where that helps the argument. And again, this is a matter of canny pragmatism. And I'm speaking to the Spanish representatives. I don't tell them my great sympathy for Colonia. And you can say, well, Scotland was an independent state. Scotland was one of the oldest independent states in Europe, if not the oldest, and was a nation state for 800 years. And that in itself is a position which differentiates itself from most other claimants. So you do have to make pragmatic distinctions whilst seeking for allies. And to be honest, this is not a form of naive bargaining. You say things to one person you would not say to another person, and that's again just how it works. But the great thing about the decolonization process is it avoids the Security Council. Once you are listed by the General Assembly as a non-self-governing territory, then you have to be decolonized. And that's not something which the Security Council can veto. So your avoidance of the veto power is an important part of this.
And if we run through, should that all go ahead, and that's kind of still a pretty high cliff to climb, but say that the UN does recognise us as a non-self-governing territory, what would then immediately flow from it? The ability to have a vote on independence, or how would we move then?
Well, it should be stated, none of this can replace any of the domestic process. By domestic, I don't mean in terms of United Kingdom law, because United Kingdom law is irrelevant. And that's perhaps the most important thing to grasp in all of this. Being a state, being an independent state, is a question of your relationship to other states. It's not in any sense a question of your domestic law. If other states at the UN vote to recognise you as an independent state, you are an independent state. If they don't vote to recognise you as an independent state, you're not, whatever your domestic law may say. Being a state is a matter of international law. It's a status in an international law.
But there's a difference between being a non-self-governing territory and a state. So how do you jump from one to the other?
Yeah. Well, the point is, non-self-governing territories are not allowed. Non-self-governing territories must achieve independence. They enter the decolonisation process, which is as old as the establishment of the United Nations itself, and therefore are on a track to independence. You can't be a permanent non-self-governing territory. That's not the purpose of the process, if you like. So once you're recognised as an NSGT, it is. The whole point of it is that you will become a state. It's a transitional recognition on the way to recognition as a state. But of course, you couldn't do that if people at home didn't want to be a state. This in no way replaces campaigning in Scotland or the need to gain a political consensus in Scotland. But ultimately, at the United Nations one day, the only way Scotland will ever become a state is by a vote recognising Scottish statehood at the United Nations. And so this is a part of kicking off that process, because we have to accept that we may come to a position. I believe we will come to a position. I absolutely believe we will come to a position where we are trying to achieve statehood against the continued opposition of Westminster, because I don't think Westminster will ever agree. And I think people who, in their minds, are fantasizing scenarios whereby Westminster happily agrees to a second referendum and then accepts the result when they lose, just not going to happen. There's just no way the British state is voluntarily going to let Scotland go.
Right. So there's not too many specifics then on this lever happens, that vote is taken, this then kicks in. I mean, there must be precedent from all the African countries that became, but actually they were just declared independent, weren't they, by the British state?
They were, they declared themselves independent, yeah, and were accepted as such by the British state. But there's it's very difficult. Once you're on the list of non-self-governing territories, it's very difficult for a state to oppose your becoming independent. In international law, there is really no way for a state to oppose you becoming independent. It makes Scotland's case far, far stronger in international law against continued opposition from Westminster. But it's very hard to do. I mean, you were saying it's a steep cliff to climb. It certainly is. There are two different committees tasked with this, and they run kind of parallel to each other. And the process is slightly opaque. There's the Committee of 24, and there's the fourth committee of the General Assembly. The Committee of 24 is a committee appointed by the General Assembly, and the fourth committee is a committee of the General Assembly itself. It's a subset of the General Assembly, if you like. And it's really, the Committee of 24 is really the one that counts. And we need to get the Committee of 24 to recommend to the General Assembly that we are adopted. And that's not impossible at all. When you look at the membership of the Committee of 24, it contains pretty well all of the states I would want to put on a committee which doesn't like the United Kingdom.
Right. Okay. Well, that's fortuitous. I have heard people say to me, for example, that in the final referendum that might be the outcome of this process, the colonizer, as in England, would not be able to be, well, English people wouldn't be able to vote, to put it bluntly. I'm not quite sure. It's from what you're saying, it sounds like there's no detail that's quite that specific at all.
No, there's not. That's not. I mean, that's not the case. It's certainly the case that the colonizer didn't ought to be controlling the process. That's certainly the case, and certainly it would be much better in. It would be much better in making certain that there are elements of international supervision, which is really what we lacked last time. It was the most important thing we lacked last time was, for example, international monitoring of the balance of media output and that kind of thing. International supervision, were there ever to be another referendum, would be extremely important. But no, there's absolutely nothing in the UN provisions that says that, and I should say personally, my own view, as somebody whose father was in the Air Force, so I was born in England.
Ditto, Craig. Precisely ditto.
I'm not entirely sure that excluding people from the franchise is the way I want to go, who are genuinely resident in Scotland. There's a great deal talked about this process, which is not entirely accurate. And partly that's a result of, I think, too much reliance on AI and Google for looking things up. And also there are elements of the UN process which don't actually in real life work the way it looks like they work according to procedures and standing orders. For example, one thing we've learned for sure is that the first committee isn't really effective. The fourth committee isn't really effective. That's not where the decision's going to be taken. It's the Committee of 24, which is the really effective one, and which has much more senior level representatives turning up to the meetings. Whereas the fourth committee, which any country can join, it's a subcommittee of the General Assembly, they just send very junior people along, and it's something of a talking shop. So these things you only learn by being in it. You can't read that anywhere. You have to actually be a part of the process.
Well, that does explain, because in doing this podcast, I was Googling around the place trying to find out what the heck's going on, and it just seems there's very little coverage of it. But hey, plus ça change. How are you doing this? Because jaunting over to New York and everything, unless you're, very well padded, this has got to be quite an undertaking for you personally.
It's a big undertaking in terms of time. I'm happy to say that in terms of my travel bill and my hotel bill, Liberation Scotland have been funding that from the contributions of their members, for which I'm obviously extremely grateful. I think it's very important to say they are not funding my Lagavulin bill, because my Lagavulin bill is enormous.
Right. Okay.
My basic transport and accommodation they are paying for, but my time is free.
Yeah, and just last thing, Craig, is there a sort of date by which something might either have to happen or might, is there some sort of, can you keep biting away at this cherry for a very long time, or does it have to come to fruition by a particular date?
No, but there is no particular date by which it would have to come to fruition. And it can be, you can get stuck in a process. New Caledonia has been stuck in a process for 25 years, despite the most outrageous colonial atrocities happening in New Caledonia by the French administration. So there is no definitive end. I personally think it will take approximately 3 years. I think about 3 years. And one thing I understand is very frustrating for people is that it's very difficult to give sort of detailed updates as to what happened. I had a long personal meeting with an ambassador of the Permanent Five whilst in New York this time. I met with two or three other people at ambassador level, met with no end of more junior diplomats. Various countries are starting to say they think they will support us. Those ambassadors need to report back to their headquarters, to their governments. Views need to be taken by governments who had never heard of Scottish independence before. So this can take time. It may involve having to go actually to some of these national governments, not just talk to their representatives in New York. But I can't say who these people are, which countries it is, for example, because these kind of diplomatic talks are necessarily on the basis of confidence, and beyond that, of course, would open up the field for all kinds of people to dash off and try to stymie us. I've no doubt CIA and MI6 were following every move anyway, and official moves will be taken, but we don't want to encourage loads and loads of trolls, for example, to start lobbying or bothering certain governments about not supporting us.
I did say finally, but this really is it. Does it seem at all weird to any of the people you're speaking to that you do not represent the Scottish government that wants independence?
Not in the least. I mean, every colony has a pretendy government, which is part of the colonial elite, who take the colonial paymaster's check and don't actually represent the people. So it's the norm to have a colonial puppet administration and have a separate liberation movement. That's how it always is. We're just fitting the normal pattern.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I know you're off a lot of Christmas card lists there, Craig, but that's you definitely. But I mean, will that not get a lot of people thinking, well, I don't know if I just actually see the Scottish government as a puppet administration? Do they have to sort of, do you have to accept that for the colonisation argument to work?
I think you do. I mean, I've always viewed Holyrood as a trap, not as a path to independence, a trap where you get led up the garden path, where you try to administer your country, where you're starved of the resources needed to administer your country. So no matter, even though the SNP in many ways have done fantastically managerially, given the hand they've been dealt, you'll never be able to make ends meet because all our resources go down to London. So I've always regarded it as a trap whereby your devolved government is going to take all of the blame that should be heaped on Westminster. And I do think people get pulled into that and manage to convince themselves they're making things better and being palliative, but actually they just become colonial administrators for Westminster. And I think that's what the SNP government are. And I have personal friends, in the SNP still, and I know they think they're doing best, but they've lost their passion for independence, and they've got no genuine view that I can see of a real path to independence. They're just stuck.
Okay. Well, yeah, doubtless there will be a lot of discussion of all of this. I keep saying last thing, but you are got so many, fingers in so many pies, Craig. The other one is the Palestine action that you're spearheading separately in Scotland to try and overturn the proscription of that organisation. There is a judgment expected in mid to late November down the road. I've seen people saying there just isn't a jurisdiction in Scotland for this, is there?
Well, yes, there definitely is. The prescription of Palestine action applies UK-wide. And yet it's the Court of Appeal of England and Wales, which is carrying out the judicial ruling. The Court of Appeal of England and Wales has no jurisdiction in Scotland at all. It's actually precisely the same as the case on the prescription of Parliament, where Gina Miller lost in the English courts, but Joanna Cherry won in the Scottish courts. And the Scottish courts have every much as right to judge this as the English courts. They're supposed to be on equal standing, but that had never been, until the Cherry Miller case, that had never been tested before. No one had ever done it. We'd always just passively accepted that it's the High Court of England and Wales that decides for Scotland cases like this. So, no, we have our own legal tradition. We have our own law, and we have different traditions when it comes to the standing of Parliament and the sovereignty of the people and what that represents. So it's actually an extremely important statement to take this to the Scottish courts, not just to the English courts. And for what you're saying earlier, people, we've got the SNP with all of its resources and all the resources of the Scottish government and huge budgets. Why is it this broken down nearly 70-year-old man in Edinburgh who's doing all of this? I actually don't want to do all of this. I genuinely don't. I'm knackered. Why is this all falling on me? Because these are all things, taking Scotland's case to the United Nations, fighting the prescription of Palestine action through the Scottish courts. These are all things the SNP should be doing if the SNP is a genuine independence movement. So, and I will happily hand it all over tomorrow if it'll pick up the burden.
Right. Well, I'm sure there'll be a few of them listening to this. So, I'm not holding my breath that there'll be any response, but I'm sure everyone would join me in saying, "Gone your cell, Craig."
Thank you, Lesley. Thank you.
Sarah Salyers. Have I even said your name right?
Yes, surprisingly.
Right, because it's an odd one, isn't it? Where does it come from?
It's my married name. My husband, John Salyers, some way back ancestor of his went over to American French Revolution, and he was a Sayer. And the Americans are like about names. They just shove them down the closest they can get to something English. So his family became Salyers. They were actually Cherokee, married into the Cherokee, but Salyers remained. So,
right. Gosh. So coming to you then. So where were you brought up? Because your accent's quite a bit mixed now, she said in a quite mixed way herself.
That makes us interesting. I was born in Rosyth, but my parents moved to the West Indies when I was 2 because my dad was running a power station out there. And we came back. We were going to go to Sweden, but he was killed. So I was in Rosyth till I was 10. Then my mum got a job in the Channel Islands for 3 years. Then I was left in North London for 5 years. Then I came home. And then I met my husband, and he couldn't move here. So I moved there. So I was in the States for 10 years. And then I came back in 2012.
Right. So that's quite a story, actually, originally. When did you set up Salvo?
It's 3 years and a bit, so 2022.
Mm-hmm. And had you been involved, forgive me, I'm not knowing, but in the independence campaign, as it ran along?
I first joined when I was 28, which is years ago now, and was a member of the SNP. Those were the days when we used to have our meetings in the library that has been sold off. And we'd never be quorate, and we'd send runners out to the pubs to find who of our members is sitting in the pub, tell them we'll buy them a pint if they come in and vote so that we can get things passed. So, and I campaigned for Winnie Ewing, and I attended, those conferences where I was there when the vote on whether we supported devolution or held out for independence was taken. So I was in at the really exciting time.
Right. So you have been in at the sharp end. So to kind of bring it through then, I mean, lots of the people who listen to the podcast have emailed to say, you really should give us an update on what's going on with the case to say that Scotland is a colony and that the Treaty of Union, well, it doesn't apply, or it isn't being applied properly. We're going to go through the argument, but just to come to the, as it were, news bit of it, what have you been doing is it Geneva?
Well, we've been, this year, we have been in New York twice and Geneva once. And I was in Geneva. That was for the first event at which we were able to set out what Scotland's case is, with an attendance audience that were from all over the world. People from there were Sikh representatives, Tamil, Alaska. The African Union was present. That's a big deal. Chinese delegates who came over from Hong Kong. And it's if you think of it, if you think of the United Nations more as a parliament than as a court, because most people tend to think of it as just one thing, and they think of it like some sort of court. It's really not. It's like a massive parliament with lots and lots of committees and just as many factions. Only, multiply what you know, if you know anything at all about, say, the European Parliament, multiply it by 10 or 100, and you've got the UN. So what you're really doing is you have a strategy to take you from, say, A to Z. The beginning of that is that you have to have support, and you have to have awareness the story that the Anglo-British state told the world and has been repeating about Scotland's status within what it calls the voluntary partnership is what the world has believed. And when we take it apart and explain what really happened and how identical Scotland's experience was to Ireland's, say, people are astonished. They had no idea. So,
okay, well, take it apart then. Do that thing.
Okay, so we have an argument that was. So let me see if I can just turn this on its head a little bit. Quite recently, so people understand why we're doing this, why this matters. Quite recently, John Swinney responded to proposals from members to declare independence, make a unilateral declaration of independence based on if we could get a clear plebiscite in 2026. Can you remember what he called it? I think he might have said it was madness.
Can't remember. There's too many shots at this one, but yeah, probably.
But it was a word like that. And I thought, he's got a point, but he hasn't told people why. So here comes I wish it was reducible to a nice meme, but it's not. Here we go. Independence doesn't happen at home. It happens when you're recognized as a sovereign independent state. And that requires the international community to do that. There are an awful lot of provisions within the United Nations Charter for the rights of states, as well as for the rights of peoples and the rights of individuals. So the way that it's set up, if there is a state that is lawful and recognized, and it may have component territories within which there are distinct peoples, the integrity of that state is part of it's part of the integrity of the international order, and that state has a right to maintain its integrity, its territorial boundaries, its political identity, it's all of that. And if there is a distinct people within that territory that does not wish to remain part of that state, that must be negotiated. That's international law. If that does not happen, then you are likely to end up in the same position that Kosovo is now in. Kosovo's independence is contested by about 10 countries. And you can't you can't get into the UN on a Kosovan passport, for instance. It does not have a seat at the UN. Kosovo cannot negotiate for itself with international treaties. It cannot take part in international arrangements like Interpol and so on. It has to have third-party advocates, acting on its behalf, which does not always result in the best deal for a country, by the way. And it has been fighting that for 30 years? Moving slowly closer and closer, but it's still contested. It's in an awful sort of no man's land.
Sarah, I'm sorry to jump into the middle of this, but that's exactly the scary bunny stuff that people fear Scotland would inherit if, London just goes, oh, I see no case.
That is why, John, that is the only route that those who don't recognise Scotland's real position, the only route that people see is where we would get Westminster permission, which of course is never going to happen. But if we don't, what John Swinney is seeing is the scary bunny stuff. And it's real. It's real scary bunny stuff. It's not something to be dismissed. The world is not going to go, hooray, hooray, we all love Scotland, because the UK and its allies will immediately contest. Immediately.
So however, what's your line then?
There's an exception. If the state does not have the integrity it claims to have, if it is, in fact, an annexing power, an administering power with a dependency, and not an integrated partner that has helped. And in the UK's case, and we'll get to that, it's really shocking. But if you are a dependency, if you're a non-self-governing territory, the administering power, the annexing state, the foreign sovereignty that has imposed itself, does not have a right to hold on to what it's taken as part of its integrity. So once that is recognized, if you can, and it's going to be one hell of a job, but we're going to do it. Once the real position is recognized and you are listed as a non-self-governing territory, then if you have a democratic event in which the majority say, we don't want to be colonized anymore, we call that independence, then the administering power doesn't have a right to stop you. It can't say you're breaking up a lawful state and undermining peace in the world, and we're going to contest this. It would be unheard of.
So your aim is to persuade the members of the UN, well, you need one member to kind of really take this thing forward, that Scotland has been colonized by England?
Yes, that we do not have. So what people think of when they think of a colony, they think of the Belgian Congo. That and it's a little bit like when we think of slavery, we think of chattel slavery. We don't generally understand the great range of conditions that are actually conditions of slavery, and they're recognized conditions of slavery. Scotland is in every respect what you would call a colony. If you look at post-colonial theory, and Alf Baird has done an amazing job of synthesizing that so that you can actually go, oh yeah, that is Scotland in kind of every one of these markers. You then think, well, hang on a minute, what happened to this partnership? You go back, you find that what happened to Scotland in terms of the voluntary union isn't unique. That was the same claim made of all kinds of colonies, that they were in a voluntary union. They'd entered into this contract voluntarily. Trying to think of the one that Crawford and Boyle, Treaty of Waitangi. So they hold that up and say, there you go, the Treaty of Waitangi. That was a treaty given to peoples in New Zealand, Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, mistranslated so that it didn't say what they thought it said, and then held up as legitimizing this colonial rule ever after. Scotland had a treaty forced on it, and the treaty is the thing that makes us different in every respect. When you define a non-self-governing territory, and if you look online on our Liberation website or on the JPTI website, you'll see the case that was put forward that puts Scotland in the same frame as every other non-self-governing territory in terms of UN resolutions. But apart from that, we have something unique. And what we have that is unique is that in order, and I checked this with a retired Supreme Court judge, in order to be a voluntary partner, you must have a partnership agreement. And at least some of the terms and conditions of that partnership agreement must apply. Certainly the foundations should apply. And the foundation of the partnership agreement is that a new kingdom, one unitary kingdom, was to come into existence called Great Britain, for which kingdom there would be a parliament thus establishing a new state, and that is what everybody has said happened. And it never transpired. There are two crowns. They're both still in existence. A kingdom is the territorial jurisdiction of a crown. England's coronation oath was extended over Scotland. The English Parliament continued without missing a beat. So what happened was the treaty was just put in the bin, and it has been held up as authorising that act of annexation ever since.
And in addition to that, there's also the claim of right being kind of at odds with the constitutional outlook of England, which is entirely parliamentary sovereignty, whereas the claim of right as a legal document, as a constitution for Scotland, was about people's sovereignty.
That's a really interesting one, because there's kind of three parts. I've just done a summary for a friendly state. And there's kind of three parts to, or four, if you like. We meet all the definitions under UN Charter of a non-self-governing territory. We're supposed to have a treaty, but like 200 other British treaties, the one that we signed was just put in the bin so that annexation could take place. We had conditions for that union. and that are called fundamental and essential in all time coming. And one of those was the ratification of a 1706 Scottish Act, which says all of these other acts are going to remain in place after the Union, but the only one it mentions and actually says has to be followed in full is the Claim of Right Act. And that's because the Church of Scotland did not believe they'd be able to protect the religious freedoms in Scotland if they didn't hold on to that, the Claim of Right and the rights of the people under that Act. By the way, some of the rights that we have in the Claim of Right Act are very, very modern human rights, and some more explicit than you get in the European Charter of Human Rights, one of them being that a government is prohibited from stretching a law, using it in ways that wasn't intended, in order to criminalize political dissent. How's that for a modern, modern protection?
But so where does that get you in this argument then, the existence of the claim of right at being at odds?
What it says is, all right, we need to show that there's no treaty in place, that the absolutely fundamental conditions that would say the treaty is there, even if articles can be changed subsequently. What are the pillars that say there is no partnership? And those are precondition from which a new parliament derives its authority, making it a precedent condition of the union. So it can't be overwritten if there's a union at all. 2, what is the purpose of the treaty? To create one kingdom. Did not happen. The English crown was put over Scotland. That's called annexation. That's a foreign sovereignty. What is the result of? Was to be the result of that kingdom was a new parliament, unified parliament representing that kingdom. Instead, actually, what you had was the Parliament of England that continued unbroken. So, what we've just done is we've just painted a picture of annexation, not partnership. That means that the British state has provided to the international community and in the highest official record that there is, which is the Royal Commission, a definition of Scotland which states explicitly that Scotland is a nation and it entered the union with England voluntarily as a partner and not as a dependency. Now, it produced that at a time when absolutely nobody here in Scotland or anywhere else in the UK was asking, is Scotland, do you think Scotland needs decolonised? No, that question was only being asked at the UN. So it was produced for that. But it is what's called a privative definition. It has officially defined Scotland as not a dependency because it's a voluntary partner and what it did as a partner was create this new state. So when you can turn that on its head and you can say, there is no partnership, voluntary or otherwise, because there is no partnership agreement, because the partnership agreement was put in the bin and instead Scotland was annexed, and it cannot be anything other, therefore, than a dependency. And here is the proof. That's it. Yeah. So
yes. I'm trying to get. I've heard that bit about the annexation. It was the other aspect of the argument about the claim of right that either, you've kind of. If we are a partnership, then what happened to that different outlook? Because in that case, we should be able to have a plebiscite of some kind and say, we'd like to have a referendum or we'd like to be independent, and that should count for something, or it isn't.
And that's what I think you're exactly right. If we don't have, what we're saying is, if we say there is no partnership, the treaty is not in place, therefore there's no voluntary partnership, therefore Scotland is annexed, we then have to say, here's the proof. So the proof becomes we have none of the conditions that were agreed, the main one being the claim of right. We have parliamentary sovereignty, that's an English principle, pre-union, imposed on us.
Okay.
So it goes like that.
So supposing, people would come back at you and say, okay, so the claim of right that we're hinging a lot of this on, I hear you deal with the annexation in a minute, that sounds quite strong, but the claim of right, I mean, if that's about the popular will of the Scottish people, is that not being demonstrated at every election? And if we haven't actually, we have had a mandate, if you like, the way you would look at it from a proportional parliament, it has delivered a mandate for a referendum or for independence several times. Is that enough? The
claim of right is, I came across the claim of right, I imagine I felt like the people on Easter Island who started looking at these massive heads. I don't know if you remember, but when I was wee, it was these mysterious heads on Easter Island. Imagine my shock when somebody decided they were going to dig and see if anything was underneath them. And there's an entire statue under there. And the claim of right feels a lot like that, what it did to me. It's a very, very interesting document, and it was very, very clever. It does guarantee the sovereignty of the people. But it guarantees it in a practical way, which means that there must be, and as there used to be, there must be a mechanism by which the people are able to remove a government that is violating the compact. Scotland has a constitutional compact at the basis of its constitution, which is wonderful. The government may not, and the claim of right sets it out, it may not do A, B, and C without losing the right to govern. It may not break these rules. It may not take away people's rights. It's Lesley. This is 1689, and this is the first iteration we know of some of the basis of modern human rights. It's incredible. You may not do these things to citizens. I mean, England was doing it all over the place. So were most other European nations, and Scotland threatened with an invasion by William the Psycho Orange, responds with, okay, we'll say the things you want us to say, but we're also going to codify the central pillars of our constitution, and especially the rights we think are most important to guarantee to our people. It's absolutely brilliant. And we had a government.
But actually did that, hang on a minute, Sarah. I mean, there's the 1689, yeah, the claim of right. Well, the Scottish Parliament was still full of barons, landowners with the right of gallows and pit. They had the power to hang people for nothing. They were corrupt. They were corrupted, so that kind of, where were we using that trump card, if you'll pardon the appalling intrusion?
All over the place, Lesley. That is, I will try to find you one of the best articles I've and from a book of articles about what Scots law really looked like back then, and the comparison between the number of people who were ever condemned to death and the rights that somebody had before they could be convicted or executed for a capital crime. And I swear to God, you'll see Scotland in a completely different light. There were 3 parliaments in Scotland, not one, not chambers, 3 parliaments. And the Borough Convention had the right to weigh in on international treaties, by the way, and they also put legislation forwards. I won't go into what the Convention of Estates did, but they passed the claim of right. Salvo was an act offered at the end of every parliamentary session from 1592, by which you went into Scotland, you could go into the Parliament, you read a petition, you could challenge what the Parliament had just passed, and it would be referred to the Court of Session. And you could also refer it back the other way. And there is still a provision in Scots law, according to Robert Black, by which, because the people are sovereign, I mean, really, literally sovereign, if we all decided to drive on the right-hand side of the road tomorrow, that would be the law. That is still in Scots law. And what we got, it was 2008 before the records of the Parliaments of Scotland were gathered and actually published. They were put online. It's changed scholarship, Scottish historical scholarship, out of all recognition. But up until that point, we had all this stuff that people believed. The poor had no lawyers. Excuse me. The Poor Man's Charter, 15th century, is the first law we know of anywhere where legal aid is made obligatory by law. You give someone who can't afford a good, experienced advocate must have that paid for them out of the common good. That that was practice. Lesley, Scotland's not the country you think it was.
Sure, but I mean, forgive me for having my own family history from Caithness and Clarence, which tells me a totally different story of what was happening on the land. So that's not my understanding of a lot of what was, possible in a country that was not a democracy at that stage. Anyway, that, however, feels like it's by the by, because, I mean, if someone, as kind of pivotal in our culture as Burns was writing about a parcel of rogues, about the people who were Scots, who basically sold us out in 1707, it feels to a lot of people like whatever preceded that and whatever state of, enlightenment was present in the Scottish Parliament, nonetheless, it was sold out, games of bogey. We just got betrayed by our own people.
Well, the thing is that our own people, fortunately for us, didn't have the legal power to transfer the Scottish Crown. Sovereignty was with the people. It wasn't with them. There was a threat of invasion at the time. There were bribes paid. There were people in house imprisonment. So let's get one thing clear. We're not saying here that Scotland...
But the world, isn't the world full of that sort of stuff? I mean, if you look at lots of countries, force, might is right. And actually, you can have all sorts of framings of democracy, which is just completely overridden by powerful interests. And they've just had to kind of deal with it.
Which is why it matters, what does it look like today? Does it look like a duck, walk like a duck, and quack like a duck? So, just to backtrack a wee bit, because my family were, cleared as well. Over time, things happened, things changed, things moved, there were different influences. We're not saying, Scotland was a land of democratic, a democratic model for the world. What we're saying is it's not as it's been portrayed, and it was considerably more democratic than other European countries at that time. It had its fair share of rogues. It had its fair share, because we're just human. That's true.
But the thing is, why is any of that relevant? I mean, in a sense, the claim of right stands or it doesn't stand, and it just feels, I suppose it feels to people that other bits of history then came along, which seemed to sell ourselves out in every sort of conceivable way. And it seems hard to go back and say, hey, we're just going to come back in time and run that one again. Because that sort of seems a bit like what it feels like.
The claim of right ran. It wasn't just in 1689. It was an articulation, not of something new, but of something that already existed. And that continued to exist, and it continued to restrain the power of monarchs in Scotland, and it continued to entitle the people to petition and to protest and to protect their civil rights. And when William the Orange tried to overrule that and stop the right of the people to petition, and in Scotland that had a very specific form, that much more robust than signing a piece of paper and sending it in, he was reminded that he had signed up to the claim of right. So, this wasn't a nice a sort of meme or a rhetorical thing. This was an iteration of something that absolutely existed. And no, it didn't exist in a perfect society, but neither did it exist as a sort of aberration in a feudal lockdown where the people...
I hear you, Sarah, but I'm just wanting to know, did we blow it? I mean,
no.
That's the point.
No, because if you enter into a contract, so think about it as a contract. The people who signed that contract should never have signed it. We know that, but we know, and you can look at why they did and what happened and so on, but they signed it. Here's the thing. Once you've signed that contract, well, that's you, unless the partner with whom you've signed the contract tears it up and says, and now I'm going to do something completely different. We have catched Scotland. Now we have to bind her fast. So we may have signed it, but the claim of right comes in because that was one of the conditions. The effect of the treaty was supposed to create a new kingdom. It didn't. It's just England called Great Britain. England continued.
So what would have to have happened for it to have been like a proper new union? Would there have to have been, we moved from Westminster to Leicester or something? Or, what would have to have happened to have made that look right in your eyes?
I'm not sure what would have ever made it look right in my eyes. I think I'd have been with the naysayers right from the word go. But in legal terms, you have one crown. You don't have an English and a Scottish crown. The Scottish crown still exists constitutionally, not just as a physical object. The treaty would do what it said. You'd have a new kingdom. And the Parliament would start on the date when the Parliament was supposed to start. It wouldn't meet again after the last session of Anne's.
Okay, so is this slightly, forgive me being a bit, sort of colloquial, but is this like an Al Capone sort of thing where, there's all the stuff that you might want to argue, but they just got him on the tax fiddling. Is this, I mean, if they just stopped literally and started again and said, yeah, okay, we've had a month off and we've moved down the road a bit and, got slightly different rules, would that have been enough? Is it just that small a difference?
No, it's the crown thing is a huge difference, Lesley. A crown represents the state. The crown that calls itself the Crown of Great Britain is the Crown of England. It's been the same since 1066. It represents a distinct state, and it continued. And that is why the Parliament simply rolled on from the English Parliament from the last session. That is why Scotland's treaties all fell, but England's continued. They weren't renegotiated for this new state. That tells you what happened.
But Scotland did keep a lot of its institutions. It kept its education system, its legal system, its ability to set.
That's not a state's identity. Your identity doesn't consist of your schools and universities. It did keep those things. It didn't really even keep its legal system, by the way, although people say it does. Robert Black, it is good on that. But the mechanisms of state, councils, parliaments, crown, particularly the crown, rights of the crown, which are absolutely incompatible between Scotland and England. The international missions, embassies and treaties, those are the things by which you can say there is a state. Every one of those continued. They were all, that was England. Every single part of that was English. Everything that belonged to Scotland, its treaties, its diplomats, etc. You didn't, as Black said, the ambassadors didn't even have to present new credentials. England continued.
Scotland even if there were Scots occupying those roles, that doesn't get away from that nothing had basically changed about the substance of who they represented and whose name they were there.
That's right. They were there as part of an English state. Everything rolled on. Now, the thing that holds that, exemplifies that is the crown. That crown, the crown that represents the state is the English crown in all of its aspects. The crown in Parliament, the crown here, the civil service, all of that. It all remained English.
Right. So is this then, the two prongs, the annexing Scotland, nothing really changing. So there was no new country called Britain really set up. There was just sort of Greater England, basically. Yeah. And does that get gainsaid at all by devolution?
Not really, because it's almost every colony has had some form of devolution. Because when you have to remember that Holyrood is the Scottish executive of Westminster. It's not actually a Scottish Parliament, although we call it that. And under the Scotland Act, in fact, there are provisions that ride right across the Treaty of Union. Parliamentary sovereignty, what is reserved, what it cannot look at, the way that it's tied up. It may not, it's not even under the Scotland Act, it's not even allowed to discuss the character of the Crown or the character of the Union. That is not allowed to be discussed in Holyrood. This is an administration that we get to vote for. It's an English administration that we get to vote for, and it could be.
What? Holyrood is an English administration.
Of course it is. We vote for it. It's Scottish people, but what it is doing there is it is acting as what its correct title is: the executive, the Scottish executive of what? Of Westminster.
Well, Alex did thump Scottish executive into, the blue yonder. It's the Scottish government from his change of title.
That's lovely. It's a great word. It got us used to thinking of a Scottish government. And I agree that we need to think like that, but it isn't. It's a Scottish executive. Call it what you like. It's a Scottish executive, just like Great Britain is just England. It's the same elephant with the flowery hat on.
So take me then to where you're going to go with your case with the UN. If you get somebody to accept that, yep, Scotland essentially has been annexed, that the rules were essentially broken by not observing the claim of right, which would let us have a way out if we wanted it. How are you going to progress that in a way that lets us get a crack at independence?
Well, what it means is, so the way that it goes is we already have more than one ally that would put it to the vote. Scotland's we'd like you to look at this and refer Scotland for listing for decolonisation and vote for the C4 to do that. But what we have to do is we have to make sure that we have the right number of people who will vote for us when that comes up. So that's, what that's like. That's lobbying, till you've built up your support and you've shown people what's really happening. And what's in our favour is that right now the UK is absolutely loathed by 3/4 of the international community who would love to give it a bloody nose. So this is the best time Scotland's ever had to do this.
You talked about the African Union earlier. I think they've got about 81, 86 or something. A lot of seats, basically. How are they responding to this? Because, they might say, we were colonised by Scots in many cases. So kind of making a parallel, using the word for a lot of people is difficult because you mentioned the Congo, right at the beginning. People starved to death and were crucified there. This makes it hard to kind of in the same breath think that we are colonised now.
Well, actually, every single colony, let's give you an example. There were more Irish slave plantation owners than Scots. The East Africa was controlled through Indian troops. We had satraps helping the British in India. We had, so how colonization works is always the same. You have a native elite, a group, you use them for military, and because that's the only option that they really have. Same thing with Native Americans to this day, by the way, Lesley. Most Native Americans end up having to go into the American military because there's just no opportunities for them otherwise. It's always the same. It's exactly the same across every colony. And so, yes, Scots were administrators, and they took part. The same thing happened in every single colony, with no difference. But I can tell you that those representatives of the African Union that came to our event in Geneva left saying, "Let us know what we can do to help." So they get it really fast. We talk.
If you came then to any kind of vote, how would it work then? If you do get recognition as a kind of suddenly forgotten the right phrasing.
Territory.
Sorry, say that again because I cut over you.
It's fine. It's non-self-governing territory.
So would it need a vote that's clear, like some kind of, would a plebiscite election do, or what other kind of way could there be to say we want change?
Any democratic event in Scotland, once that happens, so our work at that point is done, because what it does is it takes the boot off Westminster's boot off Scotland's neck. It means that thing that John Swinney said it would be madness to declare independence without Westminster Agreement is no longer true. We are free to have that referendum or to have that plebiscite. And then it's up to the Scots. Then it's up to us. It comes home and we do that. And we will have to organise. We'll have to do two things though. We'll have to have, Holyrood cannot, in international law, Holyrood cannot declare independence ever because it's an arm of the state. It's part of the British English state. So the arm can't cut itself off the body. That's, if you look at the Kosovo ruling, you'll see this International Court of Justice explaining why they accepted the declaration of those elected Kosovan representatives, because they did not make the declaration from the devolved parliament. They made it from this convention, this assembly. So we have work to do, John Swinney, to put a convention together in advance of this. We have to decide, how and at what point, how we'll hold that democratic event. But the point about that then is that it comes home, Lesley. It's just that we're free.
So it couldn't be a Holyrood decision, a Scottish Parliament decision. You're saying it would have to be a convention set up. By however the Scottish Parliament?
I think it needs to be, normally it's a civic convention. So people we'd want people to be getting to work now. We've got elected community councillors out there who have a mandate, for goodness sake. You're looking for people with a democratic mandate. We have a tradition in Scotland of 3 separate parliaments, one of which met when Scotland didn't have its own parliament. That's a constitutional provision that we can bring back. We can look to trade unions. We can look to, churches and mosques and temples and synagogues. We can look to community councils. We can look to all these public bodies the MSPs cannot join it as long as they are bound by an oath to the English state. So it would have to be once the session, they'd have to get to the end of that parliamentary session where they're no longer bound by that. Then they can simply move over to that convention. So what you want is the biggest possible democratic mandate, but what that group of people. But what that group of people then does, that convention does, is it simply declares independence on Scotland's behalf based on the will of the people. And in Scotland, the people are sovereign. So you do your best to make that body as democratic as you can. But the democratic event is the vote of the people of Scotland.
Right.
And we do that, not the UN.
Okay, but the vote would have to happen in what order would that be? Would that be it couldn't be an ordinary election because that would be to the Scottish Parliament, which you're saying isn't the right kind of nexus for this. There would have to be a separate vote or what?
No, you can use the vote, you just can't use the Parliament. So you can say all these people voted clearly for independence. It's just that those who are elected can't go and sit in Holyrood and declare independence. That wouldn't be lawful. So, if you had the vote, so the vote takes place. When the vote takes place, of course, Parliament's not sitting. So all those who are elected could simply choose to take their places in the convention and not in the Parliament. But the vote still counts. That's what happened with Kosovo. It's it's right there in the Kosovo rulings. That's exactly what happened with Kosovo.
Okay, right. I've got to say, I'm confused because you're saying that Kosovo, as a result of that process, has been left high and dry for decades.
Right.
So let's delete Kosovo. Honestly, I think I appreciate it's based on this, but not enough people understand the Kosovo thing to be able to follow this easily.
What I'm saying is what Kosovo did for us, and McCorkadale is good on that. There's a number of lawyers who are good on that. Is it elucidated the process, the principles, the process, and you have to understand that the Supreme Court did not say that the Declaration of Independence made by Kosovo was lawful and binding. It just said it wasn't unlawful. But Kosovo was not a non-self-governing territory. What it did do is it showed us what we have to do, what has to be in place in order not to be contested, so that we're safe. So we can say, okay, we know that Holyrood can't declare, because that's one of the contests that was put up against the Kosovan argument. We know Holyrood can't declare independence, but what we do is we do that thing that is recognised and is described by the International Court of Justice. We have a convention, civic convention, and MSPs elected once we have a vote that is for independence don't take their places in Holyrood, they take them on the convention.
Okay. I mean, there's the International Court of Justice pronounced a genocide in Gaza, which Israel paid no attention to and which Donald Trump ignored. Right. It feels like, there's a set of legal structures with situations that are a lot more serious than what we find ourselves in at the moment, where, these kind of structures, in fact, international structures, many people question where the UN is actually with the kind of level of vetoes that are going on with Russia, with America. It feels like a kind of wobbly, it feels a wee bit wobbly to kind of be as a place to sort of be trying to really fight back. And this seems fiendishly complicated. You understand it, right? But you're living and drinking it. The rest of us are going, right, okay, that's quite a lot.
It is. I'm sorry. I wish it wasn't. And it's taken a long time. It's taken me a long time to get my head around it. And one of the reasons that it's a lot is that we are not given civics in Scotland. We are not introduced to how does the EU work? How does EFTA work? What happens at the UN? What are the bodies? What are international human rights? Where do states get called to account? None of us get any of that? And they get it. In America, they have a thing they call civics, and people learn something about it, but not here. So when you start talking about it, people's eyes glaze over, and I can't blame them. But and I think it is wobbly right now. You're absolutely right. Things are flipping wobbly right now. They couldn't be wobblier, actually. There's, what comes out of this isn't, I think you and I both know, what emerges out of this is going to be, whether for the better or the worse, it's not going to be what was there to begin with. But what we're trying to do is simply use that route that is available, for as long as it is available, to remove the British state, the more I have looked at it, the more I have studied it, the more I have understood about it, the more I've understood that it's a house of cards, Lesley. It's a set of claims standing on other claims, and it works as long as people believe it, or it's not called out. It's the best analogy is it's the emperor's new clothes. It will work as long as nobody says the guy's naked. So what we're doing here is we're calling it out, but we're also getting just and by the way, there's some fun to be had with it, because if Scotland's not a voluntary partner in the Union and this state is just England, well, who's sitting on the Security Council? Who is it that was voted on to NATO? Because I don't think it was England. So there's a fair amount of political fun to be had with that. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, we simply get that card that is there in that house of cards that says you cannot hold your own referendum. You cannot say that this vote makes you independent because you're a voluntary partner in a union. We take that away, say, no, we're not. We're an NSGT. We've been recognised as such, so we can have as many votes as we want, whenever we want. It's strategy, and so we'll work our, as hard as we can to get that door open. But then, I had so many people thought we were trying to drag people along where the UN would declare us independent. It's not how independent, and no, all it does is it gives us back that right of self-determination, and then it's up to us. All we're doing is making that democratic with everything we've got in us, making that democratic right a real possibility for Scotland again.
Okay. We're going to speak to Craig Murray, who I think is in New York right at the moment, which is why we can't manage to marry up the time differences. But just finally, have you had any kind of conversation with the SNP about this?
We've tried. That members have quietly spoken to MSPs, SNP MSPs, we have quite important SNP members, and people involved with us. Doug Chapman, I know he's retired from being an MP, but he came out to Geneva, and he's agreed to come and consult for the Liberation Secretariat. We have SNP councillors, conveners.
Sure, I'm not meaning to belittle that, but as the SNP is quite a top-down party, as are they all. So if you ain't got the top brass,
what I'm saying is those people have, we have people who are in a good position to talk to the top brass, and so far we're simply rebuffed. Not interested.
But thank you very much for that explanation, Sarah.
You're welcome. I'm sorry that it's long and boring. I wish that it was short and sexy. If I could make it short and sexy, I would. It's really actually important to be to have it cross-examined and to have devil's advocate played. It's really important to air the things, because people are thinking them, and if you don't address them, there's no way of answering them.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you.